And good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today. My name is David Wardell. I'm a communications officer with the Pacific Community based here in Noumea. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about telling stories with data and statistics. I'm just going to flick my camera off to preserve bandwidth and display the presentation. As you know, data helps us derive meaning from the world in which we all live. But without data, or without stories, data can be just numbers. You might have heard this before. And it highlights the importance of communicating data and statistics with stories, something which has arguably never been more vital. Stories give us the information with the context that Phil just mentioned that we need to make sense of the data or the information that's being presented. There are many ways to tell stories with data and statistics. Today, we're going to be looking at two of them, media releases and social media. And we'll also take a quick look at how using images, video, visualizations, or animation can really help you reach and inform people or engage people with the information that you have to impart. First, though, why tell a story? And Phil has touched on this, but there are many reasons, of course, why you would want to tell a story with data. One interesting argument in favor of telling stories with data that comes from the UN ECE Making Data Meaningful series is that the availability of data can depend on the extent to which people understand that data serves an important purpose by providing a mirror on the world in which we live. The more a statistical agency can show the relevance of its data, the more respondents will be encouraged to provide that data. So essentially, by telling stories with data, we can illustrate to people the importance of data. Arguably more important still, though, is that stories allow people an access point to understand the world through data and their place in it. Once you've decided that you would like to tell a story with your data, with the data that you have, the first thing you really need to ask yourself is, do I have a story? And listed here are a few things that a story isn't. A story isn't just a description of data. For a story, it's best to think in terms of issues or themes. And as Phil mentioned, it's the context that surrounds the data that is generally the story. A technical report is not a story, nor is there a story in the fact that a survey was conducted. The findings of the survey, however, that's a story. A story should focus on how the findings or the data affect people and what the findings reveal about the state of the world. Again, that is the context. Stories get people interested in statistical information and help them or help us to understand, again, what that information means in their lives. And after reading a good statistical or data story, people should feel informed, not confused. We'll take a quick look at media releases. Media releases are stories that you write, written like newspaper articles, that you will send to a journalist or a newspaper, or a media outlet, which could be newspapers, TV programs, websites, blogs, all the many things that make up our media these days. And the point of a media release is to interest the media in the story that you are telling, with the express intention of them covering your story in their publication, whether it be online or analog. the story might be the results of a report that you have released and want to publicize. It could be anything. It could be census results with the purpose of highlighting the value of undertaking a census by showcasing how a population has changed over time. When you write your media release, it's important to think about what is the news angle and who are the media release's intended audience. Who are the end users, in other words? It's good to always remember that the intent of a media release is to interest a journalist in your story. So you should aim to make it as interesting as possible while also being factual. Try to make it relatable, and by that I mean try to make it evident why your story is interesting or important or informative or timely. And if you can, showcase your findings in a wider context. For example, if the data that you have is telling you that, say, there's been a rise in the percentage of COVID-19 vaccinations for a particular age group, in your media release, it's worth including, or it's vital to include the context around that to fill out the story and to make it a story. So for example, perhaps the context in this case is that perhaps the age group seeing the rise in vaccination numbers has recently become eligible to receive vaccinations. Sometimes, and it's an inexact science, of course, sometimes there might be no context. A finding might be surprising in itself. This is in itself a story. In your media release, focus on one or two things. Don't make it too complex. Simple is always better than too complex when writing a media release. But again, simplify, but don't oversimplify. As I mentioned earlier, media release isn't just a description of the data. It's the story of what the data is saying. And as you're trying to interest the media in your story through your media release, it's good practice to include a news angle. What makes this information interesting now? What will make people want to read this story? If you're able to add information to a conversation that is currently happening in the media, there is much more likelihood that your story will be picked up and used by the media, which again is the entire purpose of releasing a media release. Write your media release in everyday language. It's always good practice to write your media release story in language that someone without a technical background in the field will be able to understand. There are, however, some exceptions to this. You might be writing your media release for a technical publication or website. In that case, you'll write for that audience or that end user. But today we're talking about reaching mass media. And for that, you will be most successful in writing a story in language that, as I say, someone with no technical expertise in the field will understand. What are the elements of a media release? There's many, but one of the most important parts of a media release is the opening paragraph, sometimes called the lead. This opening paragraph should contain your most interesting information to hook or interest the reader, or aka the journalist in this instance, to make them want to continue reading and to cover your story. Keep it short, as always, but use this first paragraph to present your new or interesting information. I've just popped a couple of examples here on the slide. One is a relatively poor example and the other is a relatively good one. The not so great one is a new study probes the relationship between parental education and income and participation in post-secondary education from 1993 to 2001. This second one is much better. Despite financial challenges during the 1990s, young people from moderate to low income families were no less likely to attend university in 2001 than they were in 1993, according to a new study. That first headline isn't so great because it focuses on the study. It tells us that a study has happened, but it doesn't tell us anything about what the study found. And what the study found is the story. The second is much better as it talks about the interesting findings of the study, again, which is something that you will be able to build a story around. This is the interesting information, not that the study was undertaken. Along with the opening paragraph, the headline is one of the most important parts of a media release. We're all guilty of scanning headlines online to decide what to read. The headline, obviously, should make you want to read the story. And look, the headline should be informative, appealing, magnetic, interesting, and newsy, which is a lot. But all of that is just to say that it should grab the reader's attention. It should pique their interest and make them interested in reading the story below it. Some good things to include in your headline, again, as long as they're backed up by your findings or your data. Things like if you're able to say this is the highest since, the lowest since, something new, something that has happened for the first time, a new record or a continuing trend. Again, these are things that that stories can be built around, and they're newsworthy. The headline doesn't need to tell you absolutely everything about the story. It should be just one line of type. And look, writing good headlines is an art form, and online media now change headlines multiple times a day for the same story to test which is getting the most engagement or which is getting the most clicks. So writing good headlines takes a lot of practice, and if your media release is picked up and used by the media, they will usually rewrite the headline. So don't worry too much about getting it perfect, but you do need to make it as interesting as possible to pique your initial end user, the media or the journalist's interest, and use it to highlight the most important information or the most interesting information that you have. A couple of final points on media release, and if you remember nothing else from this presentation, please do remember this. When you're writing a media release, get to the point. Tell your story, but tell it in the most straightforward, most concise way possible. So to summarize, keep your media release short, get to the point. Don't use jargon or acronyms. Explain and use the most plain, simple language that still does justice to your data or your story. And always include the contact details of someone who can be reached for further information. We'll move on now to social media. And look, social media is a huge field in itself and constantly changing. But studies have shown 40 to 70% of people use social media as a news source. And I'm sure we're all familiar with social media and its pros and cons. But today I want to talk about the ways that social media can be used to keep people informed, increase trust in your work, which is extremely important, and combat misinformation or fake news, in inverted commas, by offering factual information from trusted sources. And of course, to engage with the media and the public. One key consideration when using social media is to communicate, one key consideration when using social media to communicate is to determine who are you talking to, who is your audience, or who do you want your audience to be, who's your end user, basically. Once you've decided this or discovered this, you're then able to tailor your content to make it relevant and or interesting to that audience. Everyone is not an audience. It's much better to be more specific in determining who you want to speak to and to use clear, simple messaging, using clear, simple language that again doesn't use jargon and doesn't use acronyms that can be understood by the people that you're trying to reach. Here's a couple of examples from the Pacific community. The Pacific community and its Statistics for Development Division and the Pacific Data Hub run a really successful weekly social media post called Stat of the Week. This is a simple post that includes a photo and a statistic from the Pacific region that is interesting, informative, and or surprising. And while they're simple posts, a lot of work goes into to putting them together. When possible, these Stat of the Week posts have a news angle, or they're used to highlight important dates or events or news items of particular relevance to the region. As an example, the middle post here is tied to International Women's Day and includes a stat related to women in the Pacific, in this case, population. I'm showing this example because it has been a really successful social media series for the Pacific community, as it presents really interesting information in an engaging way, and it's been a very successful way to engage people in data and statistics on a couple of levels, either just on the face of it, just as the Stat of the Week post and the information that that presents, or for those who are interested in digging deeper and exploring the data on the Pacific Data Hub, the Stat of the Week posts include a link to the data set that the stat comes from. And I think, as this example shows, communicating stats and data doesn't in itself need to be complicated. Like these Stat of the Week posts, communicating interesting information in a clear and concise way can really engage people or offer them a way to engage with the people, with the work that you're doing. Graphics and data go together, and Phil just spoke about how it's easier than ever to create data visualizations. And when communicating or engaging audiences on social media with the information that you have to present, they're invaluable as they offer a clear visual way for audiences to understand the data. This example here shows a new graph that's available on the Pacific Data Hub website that shows COVID-19 vaccination coverage for Pacific Island countries and territories. And when you go to the PDH and the graph and hover your mouse over it, it displays the eligible population for each country and territory. Again, putting the data in context. And it's a way to present information that makes it easy for people to see and understand information at a glance. As a general rule, using graphs, infographics, images or video on social media will, in inverted commas, increase your engagement. Basically meaning that more people will be likely to see and engage with your post, and therefore more likely to see and engage with your work. There's an old saying that a picture tells 1,000 words, and this has never been more true than with social media. This image here, or this photograph here, is one that I've used twice in this presentation. And you've probably all seen it before, as it was all over the global media and social media during and just after COP26. It still does the rounds now. It's a photo of Tuvalu's Minister for Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs, Simon Coffey, giving a COP26 statement while standing in the ocean. And I think what this now iconic photo did was ensure that Mr. Coffey's words were carried in major media outlets around the world and shared extensively on social media. And I think he might have just been or recently been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And so the photo's been doing the rounds again. And I suspect without this photograph, Mr. Coffey's words would not have been carried in the world's media and extensively on social media. And so I think this picture definitely speaks 1,000 words or more. This is a really great example of using a well-timed, newsworthy, simple but powerful and engaging image to highlight the content or the story that he or you want to tell. And these are all good things in communications, whether it's with written words, animations, images, infographics, or video. And I think this image really illustrates the power of an image and how having a great image of a video or data visualization can help to ensure that your media release or your social media posts stand out from the rest. And again, in inverted commas, it cuts through the huge amount of news that is generated every hour these days, which basically means that people will see it, which is the entire purpose of communications. I also wanted to show you a new animation that's been put out by NASA's Scientific Visualization Studios, which shows monthly global temperature anomalies between 1880 and 2021. This is an animation that's been extremely popular on social media recently because I think it presents factual information in a way, it presents data in a way that is accessible, easy to understand, simple and powerful. I'll play the video now. There's no sound on this, and it runs for just over a minute. I'm back. It took me a while to figure out how to unmute myself. Apologies. And just to finish off, while the best animation or the best image or the simplest, most compelling words might not solve the problems of our times, they can certainly shine a light on them and bring them to people's attention and help to make change, which is the entire purpose of communications. To communicate effectively, we're not only helping to keep our audiences informed, but we're also helping to build trust in the work that we do, something that's incredibly important at the moment. By presenting factual information in a way that's engaging, simple, and accessible, we can help combat things like misinformation by making real news, real facts, real data accessible and understandable to our respective audiences. Data is important and it helps us make sense of the world in which we live. It can give us a wider perspective on issues and it can help inform us and our audiences and show things for how they really are. By communicating data with stories, by disseminating our work or your work in story form using things like media releases or on social media, we're helping to keep people informed. And as this Transparency International gift says, informed people make informed decisions, which is good for us all. Thanks very much for your time today, and I'll hand back to Phil.